Welcome back to the Crimson Chat, where KU's most compelling voices share their stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jaden Hill, and today we're joined by Ray Mizumura-Pence. He's a teaching professor of American Studies, a disability scholar, and an interdisciplinary thinker. Professor Mizumura-Pence works to bridge performance, politics, and lived experience. From co-directing KU's Disability Studies Seminar to researching stand-up comedy and disabled veterans, his scholarship invites us to rethink how disability shapes and is shaped by culture. Professor Pence, welcome to the Crimson Chat.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to have you today. And before we dive into your research, I'd like to have a couple just get to know you questions.
Sure.
First, how did you come to do the work that you do today?
That's a very long story. I'll try to make it as quick as possible. This goes back to 1998. When I was in graduate school in American Studies in our great American Studies department here at KU. And I was learning quite a bit about the social construction of race. And various news stories cropped up in that year as I was being influenced by information on social construction of race. I was paying attention to court cases at the Supreme Court relating to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was one of those eureka or light bulb moments where there was a Supreme Court decision that expanded the Americans with Disabilities Act to cover people who were HIV positive. And that isn't always associated with disability for some people. And it surprised me. And so at that moment in the summer of 1998, I forget the name of the Supreme Court decision, but what I was learning as a PhD student about social construction of other identity categories like race seemed like it would make great sense to look at that with disability. So I hope that makes sense. But it was the convergence of a number of factors, and plus I have my own disabilities related to chronic illness, and I had not looked at those as part of my scholarly work, and at that point I decided to do so. And not long after that I found out that there was an interdisciplinary field in the humanities and social sciences called disability studies that looks at disability from multiple perspectives. And as soon as I found out about that and talked to some faculty mentors, I knew I was on the right track. So the rest is history, I guess you could say, and many other fields because it's interdisciplinary with American Studies.
And so speaking of interdisciplinary, when you went from undergrad to even now teaching at KU, what different fields have you been interested in and done work with?
Going from undergrad to KU? With undergrad, I must say that's kind of ancient history for me. That's take us way back into the 20th century. But it took me a while to decide to move toward American Studies. I have a degree in English, BA, and a degree in a master's in English as well. And focused on literature. And I knew I wanted to do PhD work, but I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to continue in English. So one of my mentors at Miami University of Ohio noticed that my work was becoming more and more interdisciplinary. It was hard for me to write about, for example, a Shakespeare play or something in the Harlem Renaissance without also diving into the history, the sociology, the folklore, etc. So I took his advice and decided to pursue a PhD in American Studies, and I knew that KU had a superb program, so it worked out well. And I came here in 1997, and it's been great.
Well, we're definitely glad to have you, and the work that you do is incredible. But before we get to that, because you were in English and now you're doing research over comedy, I'm curious to know, is there any performance that you've watched that's really made an impact on not only you, but your work?
That's a very good question. I'll try to give you a good answer. I'm still, even though I've been looking at disability and comedy since 2013, I feel I'm still beginning with it. And there's so much to learn about theories of humor and why people laugh and how they laugh and so on. And of course, disability and humor, there are many controversial aspects with that. So my main motivation there, and this goes back some ways also, and it relates to an event that I'm doing tonight. It had to do with the comedian Richard Pryor, who died in 2005. And I was always a huge fan of his. And I knew that he had contracted multiple sclerosis in the last third of his life. I also knew that people didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that, or if they did it in ways that I thought were not helpful. Didn't have nuance, saw it in a very one-dimensional way, as this was a tragedy for him. His career is over. Perhaps even his life is over. Well, he lived, I think, 19 years after he was diagnosed with MS, and he did all sorts of important things. So I decided I wanted to shed some light on that. So in, again, being a big follower of his comedy, I wanted to see how he worked with multiple sclerosis. He also had some other disabilities, addiction, and this gets into some definitions of disability, because I think it's only in the last 40, 50 years or so that perhaps people have expanded the scope of what counts as disability. At one time, maybe people didn't think of addiction to drugs or alcohol as a disability, but it does have a substantial impact on a person's life. So he lived with that. He had post-traumatic stress from various things in his life. Again, he had MS. He was black, so intersectionality was at work there, and that's very important to me, and it's very important in American Studies. So it was a way of making my work more intersectional. Also, I thought with comedy, this is an attention getter. If you make your research about comedy, you might get more readers than if you don't. So there's that. But tonight we'll show a movie at Strong Hall, 330 Strong Hall, that Richard Pryor made shortly before he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So looking forward to that.
I think that's a wonderful lens before we dive deeply into your work, because you're able to see how intersectional your work is and how it affects so many different parts of society. Even just thinking of comedy and disability seems like a juxtaposition almost.
Yeah.
But the way that you describe it, it shows how it really does blend together. And I'm excited to hear more about that as we continue this conversation. I want to quickly go back and just define what exactly is American Studies and what sort of classes do you teach?
Great question. I'm glad you asked. We want more people to know about American Studies, and I definitely do. Briefly, it's the interdisciplinary investigation of American culture, but also culture in America. So it's not super complicated, that distinction, but if we think about American culture, we would tend to think of, okay, what kind of culture is there that counts as American? What types of events or expressions would people tend to see as quintessentially American? Is there such a thing as an American culture? Is there one of those, or are there many of them? There's that, but also culture in America. I see this nation as a multicultural entity, so that's distinct from American culture and what people would associate with that versus many cultures within the political and geographical and economic boundaries of America. So culture in America, interdisciplinary. And there was another question you had in there, I think. Did I?
And I was just going to say, is what does a student do when they, go into American Studies? What sort of classes are you teaching? What exactly, is there like maybe a specific thing that you can pinpoint?
Sure. Well, we do have, of course, there's a path for the major in American Studies. This would involve classes such as Introduction to American Studies, which I and others in the department teach, and also a class called American Identities, United States in Global Context. And then after that, a student in American Studies has really any class on this campus if they can make the case that it fits their research interest and what they want to do. They can take that class, whether that's in physics or engineering or in poetry or visual art, etc. So it is a very wide open field with close to endless possibilities. And people are encouraged to have the agency to chart their own path in how they want to investigate culture in America and or American culture. So again, once a person starts, there are a few basic courses they need to take. There's also a theory and methods course, but most of the choices on what to take, when to take it, and so on, the student has quite a bit of say in that, quite a bit of agency.
That's really exciting, I feel like, for any prospective student. And I want to hone in on the disability side of culture.
Yeah.
From even like a class I'm taking right now, I've learned a little bit about deaf culture and that it's really, really important to that community. Can you speak a little bit to the intersectionality of culture and disability?
Yes, that's very, very smart that you brought up the deaf culture angle, because it gets into some nuances. In the deaf community, deaf with a capital D, that generally means a person uses sign language, a person has been deaf since birth, a person does not try to communicate according to the standards of the hearing community. And then within the deaf community, there is some debate over whether or not deafness is actually a disability. Some within the deaf community, and again this is with uppercase D, this is distinct from people who became deaf after they were born, maybe from an illness, and they might not use sign language, they might read lips, they might have a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. This is distinct from deaf culture with a uppercase D at places like Gallaudet University. But within the deaf community, sometimes they see themselves more as an ethnic group than as a disabled group, even though the Americans with Disabilities Act does cover deafness. So it's complex. Now with disability culture, the general take on that is that and I teach a class right now, a first-year seminar in disability culture, and have a fantastic group in there. We're having, I hope, a blast. I hope I'm challenging them in a benign way. But disability culture really, as we know it now, emerged out of the disability rights movement, because the disability rights movement brought together people across the disability spectrum, or spectra, more than one spectrum, because there are so many of them. Before the disability rights movement and what it generated to bring so many disabled people together with their own agency, you had polio communities, perhaps, that's an example. You had communities of blind people, deaf people, as you say, but there, with very few exceptions. I can think of a case in the 1930s. I don't know if we had time to talk about it. There really wasn't what we call pan-disability. In other words, like I said, people of all disabilities coming together in one cultural tent to generate meanings, to generate expression, values, etc. So it's very much connected with the disability rights movement and that solidarity across many disabilities.
Now, to move into some of your current work, you've been researching with AUMI KU InterArts since 2011.
Yes.
What is that project, and how does that intersect to what we've been talking about right now?
Glad you brought that up. Yes, AUMI KU InterArts since 2011, and Professor Sherry Tucker, a wonderful colleague, one of the best people I've ever known, one of the best people on this campus. She knew about the adaptive use musical instrument, which there are research sites for AUMI around the country and in Canada. There may be some outside our hemisphere too. I'd have to check on that. It is free software for computers and smartphones, and it's absolutely free. There are no in-app purchases. And it facilitates music making by people of all abilities. So people who are not disabled use it. People who are disabled also use it. It's been used, for example, in settings, children with developmental disabilities. It's been used with great success with that population. People who have very, very little movement. Maybe it's a blink. The AUMI can pick it up, translate that into sound, and you're often making music. And so, yeah, we started that in 2011 here at KU. In 2012, it picked up momentum. We did things with Independence Incorporated over on Haskell Street. That's what they call an independent living, nonprofit, staffed and and don't want to say owned and operated by people with disabilities, but definitely operated. We did a workshop there with the ALMI. We've done several performances on campus with the ALMI. We have lots of YouTube videos. We have a book that came out early in 2024. So Sherry Tucker and many other people on campus and off campus too, that's one of the best things about it. We don't have any boundaries between academia and out there. We have dissolved those boundaries. People come together to make music, to dance, to use the ALMI, and it revolves around the notion that music making is a human right.
That's really exciting and amazing how you've brought in and created such a community. And there's something that you spoke about at the very beginning that I'd like to touch on again.
Sure.
And it's the idea that it's not just for people who have a disability. It's for everyone. And could you speak to the idea that creating accessible buildings or accessible musical instruments or any sort of accessible thing, how that's helpful for everyone in society, not just people who have disabilities?
Absolutely. Yeah, the disability rights movement, like other social movements, it exemplifies the public emphasis of American studies and disability studies. We want our scholarship to be first rate in academia, but we also want it to reach people outside academia. So it's, I think I lost the thread there a little bit. Can you remind me of the kernel of the question just a little bit again?
Yeah, I was just asking why is it really important that when we create accessible buildings or musical instruments or anything like that, how it's helpful for the broader society, not just people who are disabled?
Yeah, the public value of accessibility. Well, KU is a public university, first of all, so of course the laws say, going back to 1973, that KU receives tax dollars, so KU has to make reasonable accommodations to be accessible. So it being a public university and people visit KU continuously, so it just makes sense that the life of this invaluable, beautiful university that we have should be as open to as many people as possible. So the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, and the ADA and other laws help facilitate that. It still isn't completely there because, as I mentioned, reasonable accommodations. So if it's determined that it costs too much money to make the accommodation, it might not happen. Or if it's an old building, an historic building, that it would damage the building to make it accessible, it wouldn't happen. But most of the time, it does take place. It enables an ever-increasing number of people to be involved with the life of the university. And I believe in public education. I believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. So accessibility for disability helps get us closer to that. It's like we're continuously working to get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, and the ADA and some of those laws, they are aimed at the disabled community, but that community is connected with so many others, so that's why.
Well, it's really exciting, and you've done amazing work, you're doing amazing work. One thing that I'd like to ask is, what is one misconception about disability that you would like to challenge with your work?
I would say that there are many misconceptions. That is that's a challenging question, but the challenge is a good one. I would say that I'm sorry, I can't. It's hard to come up with just one. But
if you'd like to say multiple, you can say multiple as well.
Well, the individuality is perhaps the major value in the United States, and a subset of the disability rights movement is the independent living movement. But independence for disabled people generally does mean something different from independence for people who aren't disabled. And there's more of an element of interdependence in that independence for disabled people. But really, I think that the disability rights conception of independence is really closer to everyone's more than people might realize, because when we really look at our daily lives, smartphones, filling up the gas tank, feeding ourselves, getting enough water, sleep, etc. How many of us truly do those things without any connection with other people? We don't. So it's a misconception that to assert one's individualism as a disabled person is all that different from a non-disabled person, because we're all interdependent, and that is nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to embrace.
And it's true, I mean, humans are made for belonging. I mean, even on Maslow's hierarchy of need, right after your, food, water, shelter,
Indeed.
It's belonging. So I really appreciate you speaking to that point and that idea that it's true. Nobody completely does it on their own, and they shouldn't. What's next for your research? Is there any exciting project that you have coming up?
It's easier for me to start things than finish them. I have many, many ideas, and I enjoy the process of doing the work. I enjoy the detective work. I love research in all its manifestations. So my current goal is to finish a journal article in which I look at Richard Pryor's multiple sclerosis and Jamie Foxx's recent experience with having a stroke. And he talks about that in a Netflix special, and that's a fantastic Netflix special. So I wanted to compare those two performers because they have many similarities but also some profound differences. I think there'd be a good audience for this article, that it would reach people who are interested in disability, chronic illness, performing, comedy, race. So that's my immediate goal, is to wrap that up and get it in print.
Well, that's definitely exciting, and definitely people should keep their eye out for that. Do you have any advice for students who want to pursue a similar scholarly research as you, or similar scholarly work as you, whether that be in American Studies, disability, even just interdisciplinarily? What advice would you give to a student?
Cultivate relationships with people who have been there and are still there, and learn from them. And also have a business plan in looking at the options for your work in terms of funding it and sustaining it, because that's always an issue no matter what kind of research you do. There are more challenges with that with humanities and social sciences because of the nature of academia and and the economy right now, but the opportunities are there. A person might need to be more creative sometimes, or more innovative in the humanities and social sciences like I am, but to get organized early on and stay that way so you can do work that is innovative and uplifting and motivating for the greatest numbers of people. So have a business plan, but also maintain your idealism, and don't be afraid to embrace what seem like outlandish visions, or what some people might tell you are outlandish visions. You know, that's...
Well, you definitely stand as a great role model for anyone wanting to follow this. You've done amazing work, you're doing amazing work, and I look forward to follow what you do. Thank you so much for sharing your work, sharing your wisdom with us. Your scholarship really just reminds us that disability isn't just a topic, it's a way of seeing, it's a way of listening, and it's a way of building those relationships that we all need in our lives. To our listeners, stay curious, stay compassionate, and make sure you follow us on social media to stay up to date with more amazing KU stories. We'll see you next time on the Crimson Chat.